Well, I'd like to welcome you to Timeless Textiles, Emma. Congratulations on this exhibition. There's lots to talk about today, so we're just going to have a bit of a chat about you and this exhibition and your artwork. So tell us a bit about Elephant in the Room. Where did that come from for you?
It kind of all started from TAFE, really. When I can remember sitting there, we were sort of set with the task of the 3 graces. We had to kind of work on redoing our own version of the 3 graces. And
I remember that. That was a great experience.
Yeah, so I can remember just thinking, well, I don't want to do 3, I want to do something a bit different. And I was like, well, I'm going to go on the opposite of graces and went with the 4 disgraces. So I chose the 4 people that were involved in creating the Sykes-Picot line that went through Syria, Iraq, around that sort of British, French, Middle East. And I just sort of got really into exploring that and that whole idea of this absurdity of the British and other colonial empires drawing lines through maps.
Was that something big for you in your childhood, this whole link with the Middle East?
I think it kind of stemmed from, I think just the link with colonialism, really, because like my granddad he was in the Royal Air Force just after World War II, and I had family members that were stationed in North Africa during the war, and so it kind of just all kind of stemmed from there. And I've just always been obsessed with, initially I was obsessed with empire and this sort of quite fantastical kind of, boys' own adventure storytelling sort of thing when I was a kid. But it was only when I became an adult that I started going, there's some sort of dark sides of this, and it's not all as rosy as I thought it was. So I kind of really started to question that and look at myself as a sort of product and part of the empire myself, sort of thing. So I was just that's what drew me initially. So, but the elephant side of things was from within my research, finding out and reading about the shooting an elephant for George Orwell, and that's sort of what really, that realization that the elephant kind of represented empire, and also the elephant in a room, it kind of was a nice fitting thing about never talking about the things that we should be really talking about.
Which brings us really nicely to you, Emma, because when I heard about Elephant in the Room, the title, I actually thought it was about you personally, because there's obviously an elephant in the room with you. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I feel like when I was naming the show, I think subtly and I probably was referring to me as the elephant in the room, and that realization. I think because of the work, I was sort of focusing a lot on, I suppose, these ideas of masculinity and empire, and I was sort of really finding it quite challenging to sort of see this whole kind of idea of empire was all very male dominated, and this idea of these adventurous sort of people that were going exploring and conquering, Livingston and all those kind of people. And I just sort of, it never really sat well with me anyway, my gender, and so I think it was sort of like through a process of many other things going on at the same time, that this work, this whole exhibition was kind of me starting to sort of pick apart my understanding of masculinity and gender and my place in the world, and so the elephant in the room became me. So,
because when we met, which was probably about 4 years ago, we were both at TAFE looking at aqua tinting, and I knew you then as Chris Clifton.
Yeah.
And Chris is no longer around, and what we have is now Emma. So that's a really large event that's occurred.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those things where I was really reluctant initially to have this show. I sort of wanted to sort of have it as Chris still, and that's why the name is still there. But then through a process of things that happened throughout after booking the show, it just became kind of a process that just had to happen, and I had to become Emma sooner than I thought I did. So it's sort of an interesting, it was kind of like a farewell to Chris, really, this whole, the elephant in the room will be no more, because I'm kind of, it's not yet, I am very openly talking about it and quite happy to acknowledge that I am a trans woman. Well, not even trans woman, it's sort of like, it's even this, it's like a trans feminine is probably where I would sit myself in, really, rather than the whole binary idea. I don't sit well with that at all, so yeah.
Thank you so much for explaining that, because I'm sure for people watching your conversation may be a little confusing.
Yes.
So that's very helpful, thank you. Do you think that becoming comfortable in the trans feminine world, that's impacting on your work?
I feel like it's in sort of still quite an early stage. It seems weird thinking that these works were made by Chris, but then at the same time they were made by me, regardless of, like, it wasn't my gender that made these works. So I think I will still make the same works. I will still have the same concerns and explore the same issues, and I still have that same aesthetic, but whether that changes or not is completely nothing to do with my gender. So the idea of maybe the subject matter will change over time, because as I change, my experiences of the world changes, so I might become, more kind of interested in certain aspects of, I suppose, the feminine sort of world, and be very sort of keen to sort of still make statements about it. But fundamentally, when things irritate me in the world, I like to create art to challenge those and get my views across.
It's very interesting timing, this exhibition. Even though we planned it years ago, it just seemed to coincide with the passing of the Queen, and to have an exhibition up about the impact of the British Empire, which was very brutal on colonies, has brought a lot of conversations into the gallery about that. Would you like to talk a little bit about what it is about that brutal impact that's driven you to create this exhibition?
I think a lot of it stems from when you I was a student of history, still am, and I taught history at high school, and I can also just remember having a conversation with my granddad when he was alive about his kind of how he felt being in Kenya, because he served in Kenya in the RAF, and his role in, I suppose, fighting an independence movement at the time. It was in the 50s, so it was before Kenya was sort of decolonised. So, and there was no concern at like what kind of impact he was having. And I suppose I was young at the time when I was sort of asking him these questions, but I think that sort of started sparking that idea of like, well, how can we be so like complacent and just so like I had family members that probably killed people in Kenya, and I feel like that never sat well with me. And then particularly as a teacher, I started to then, over here in this country, started to realise, well, my initial kind of concept of Australia and the whole history of Australia kind of, as I was taught it as a child, as many Australians were taught it as a child, also just didn't sit well with me. It was just like, well, that's not the reality. And I feel like things like the royal family and all those sort of very British colonial institutions just always were just jarring. And I was just like, how can we be so blasé about it and not sort of really understand that there is a lot of bloodshed that went on, and there was that like particularly in this country, like being told that you were suddenly the royal subjects of a king or queen far off, but then brutally murdered at the same time. It's kind of like it just sort of never really, the hypocrisy of the whole empire and it just never sat well with me. And so I kind of felt like I was not happy at the timing of this sort of thing, but I feel like it certainly aided the debate and that kind of that whole, the importance of, well, we really need to sit back and take a good hard look at ourselves and who we are.
On the wall around you, you've created 7 faces. What were those faces around? Why did you choose those 7? Maybe not in detail for all of them, but...
Those sort of faces were, at the time I was just really fascinated with the fact that obviously now there's a real kind of strong anti-colonial kind of movement, and there always has been, but I was always just, as a history teacher as well, I was always kind of fascinated by, you know, there's the whole adage that, you know, it's only the victors that tell history, and it's only the winner's story. And it's sort of like, for me, I was just really curious about, well, who were those people behind the scenes that were kind of actively at the time fighting against the British, not necessarily in physical violence, but also behind the scenes in very kind of peaceful protesting. So like Gandhi was like very well known in his views towards the British and the Empire. But then there was other people, like this guy Bhagat Singh. He was essentially a terrorist, and he would do a lot of terrorist acts as a way of kind of revolt against the Empire and sort of pushing the sort of people to kind of rebel all the time. But then there were also like people like Nasser, who is the Prime Minister, the President of Egypt, and he's sort of one of the main instigators behind the whole sort of the Suez Canal kind of catastrophe that kind of emerged during the time. And yeah, and I just sort of like, and it was not just men, there was women as well. So there was, I can never say her name, and I'm not going to do it justice, but Hudi Shaharawi, and she was an Iraqi woman that was resisting too, and it was just like, so it was all these people that were just not comfortable, and rightly so, with people coming and taking their land and drawing lines through places. So I kind of like, for me it was about kind of honouring them for their contribution in this whole decolonial movement, but then also kind of hiding them, because that's what the British do. We don't want people to know about the dissenters, and so it's about kind of celebration, but also trying to keep them a bit hidden as well. Alright, and then so this flag was the whole kind of idea behind the flag was, I can remember there was a flag that we used to have in our family that was sort of taken, was acquired by it was like sort of my granddad's brother or something like that. It was kind of like it was a close relative that was serving in North Africa during World War II, and as the Nazis were being driven out of North Africa, he grabbed a Nazi flag off the back of a truck, and on that flag was blood and dirt and sand, and it was just, and for some reason that flag has stayed within our family, and I was always felt really strange holding that flag and looking at it, and sort of it was like, are we celebrating this, or is this celebrating the kind of the victory over another empire, or it just never sat well with me. And so the Union Jack is such a symbol of empire, and I really wanted to desecrate the flag and show that I'm not happy. I don't like that flag is meant to kind of represent who I am as a citizen of the UK, and so I set about creating the most ugly flag that I possibly could. So that's why the stitching is not very good, and that's why there's lots of kind of nothing straight, and then it was about kind of just desecrating it and saying what the empire really is, which was a brutish empire, not a British empire. And that's sort of taken by, there's a couple of poets and a couple of writers that are doing some really good sort of wordplay on the whole idea of empire, and I just that sort of word stuck with me, this brutish empire, because it's only one letter change, but it just says it all. So yeah, it's blood and tea stain, because most of the empire was built on tea. So yeah, so these ones, so when I was talking about the initial idea behind the whole project, these are the oldest works in the whole exhibition, and they started off originally as just some scrap pieces of paper from old books written about the empire and colonialism from sort of kind of, you know, white men's sort of perspectives. And these papers were all quite kind of moth-eaten and sort of stained with time, and I really liked the look of it, and I drew these portraits of the Mark Sykes, Pico, and then these other two, the British and the French, that kind of got together and they basically drew a line through a map in the Middle East just before the end of World War I to say, well, we all know that we're going to win the war, again, the arrogance of the British Empire, and they decided that, okay, well, in anticipation of that, we're going to divide all this land up so that, you know, the French can get this part and the British can get this part. And it was all about the oil. So the French they had oil assets in certain parts of Syria, so they were like, oh, we're having that. And it was kind of done with complete disregard for whose land it was, just like the British have done everywhere. And so I just like the concept for me was about, well, they drew lines through land that wasn't theirs. I'm going to draw lines through their faces as a way of just sort of, well, how dare you? And I just sort of, and the fact that it was the act of drawing this line that sort of bound those people together forever. And and so I just sort of worked on those initially as paperworks, but then they've evolved into these mixed media textile works. So.
And you've used red stitch throughout this whole exhibition as a way of stitching it together.
Yeah, and for me the red is a sort of the symbol of the empire, but it's also a symbol of the blood, and the sort of the veins that run through my sort of veins, and I'm sort of like forever tied to being British. I'm forever tied to it, and it's something I'm not particularly feel great about, really.
Emma, where to from here?
Lots on the horizon. I'm basically I'm currently in the sort of throes of my PhD, which is going to be looking at the impact of deindustrialisation as opposed to colonisation, but the impact of deindustrialisation on working class people and their connection to place and their ideas, a sense of belonging and their identity. Particularly given that the Hunter Valley is going to be experiencing a significant change in the economic, social, environmental makeup. And because of that we're on the cusp of that transition, I sort of thought, well, I've lived through that transition process before, and I'm also going through another transition process again. But for me, I grew up in a coal mining town in northern England that was rapidly deindustrialised, and the social and economic implications of that were just atrocious. And so I'm just fascinated with sort of pulling that apart. And I also I'm bringing along through these collaborative arts-based workshops to kind of bring along other members of the Hunter Valley community who have had a connection to the coal industry to kind of, just suppose, workshop and process that idea of what it means for them, this whole transition process. So, obviously I focused on Africa, the Middle East, but for me, there's more places that have been impacted, a significant number of places that have been impacted by colonisation, not just by the British, but by the French, the Portuguese, etc., etc. So I was reluctant. I was initially thinking about including Australian experience of colonisation, but I've always been acutely aware at the time as a British white male, of how that can be perceived if I enter into that space of indigeneity. And so I was always kind of really reluctant to sort of, particularly to include it in this exhibition, but I feel like there's certainly space in the future, I think, for me to collaborate with Indigenous people if possible, if that was even desirable or wanted, to kind of, I suppose, question the local ramifications of colonisation here, of which there has been significant. Yeah, and I just think I think all the work that I do from now on is it's all about, I suppose, getting us to talk about those uncomfortable truths and whatever truths they are. But I mean, I feel like that's my role as an artist and as a human being is to sort of question and to kind of make people talk. So,
Well, congratulations
Thank
to
you.
you.
no, thanks very much for having me. It's been a great show. I'm really glad to have been here.
I certainly admire your courage, both in terms of your work, calling it out and speaking your truth, and also for you personally. So congratulations
Thank you.
to you.
Thanks.